So, teacher asks a question of a class, what do you want to be when you grow up? Little boy at the front, Kevin, we'll call him Kevin, he shoots his hand up and he says, I want to be a multi-millionaire. I don't want to work, I want to be on permanent holiday. I want to eat in the best restaurants, stay in the best hotels. I want to take the best girl with me, best looking girl with me. I'll provide her with unlimited credit cards, a jet to fly over Europe. We'll have holiday homes in Tuscany, the Bahamas, luxury apartments in London, Paris, New York. You imagine the teacher slightly shocked at this individualistic, misogynistic, slightly unrealistic aspiration of Kevin, and goes to her go-to 12 o'clock steady girl, Charlotte. Thank you, Alistair, for that. Goes to Charlotte and says, Charlotte, quickly, what do you want to be when you grow up? And she says, I want to be Kevin's girl. Now, this rather trite story actually highlights a bit of a contradiction inherent with the system, and that's what children think they're getting from school, what they want from school and from wider society in general, and what we expect of them, because we actually encourage children to respond more subtly to that question. Not what do I want to be when I grow up, but what do you need me to be when I grow up? I mean, if you've ever asked children what they want to be when they grow up, it's fascinating, actually. So we know that, for example, if you poll primary school children, 12% want to be sports stars. That's not people just earning money from sport, you understand. That's actually being famous for it. 11% film stars, 11% pop stars. 9% want to be astronauts. And given there are about 4.2 million primary school children in the UK at the moment, that's about 378,000 aspirant astronauts, only one British person in space right now, and only 7 since 1968. You've got to have a dream, right? 5% of them want to be chefs, so clearly they've never worked in a kitchen before, so actually want to be TV chefs. Only 4% want to be teachers now, and 1% want to be politicians. Now, you compare that to 25 years ago, when actually 15% of people wanted to be teachers. And actually, the aspiration to be famous wasn't there when people thought about careers, and actually service to others was a more, underlying value of what they did. You'll note, however, that of the 9% of people who want to be bankers back in the 1980s, that doesn't even make it into the top 10 of today's list, which will be of alarm, I should think, to some politicians and journalists, because they may soon have no one to look down on. What children, however, in that moment of reflection, what they fail to seem to do is really conceive of anything beyond themselves. We know boys, for example, actually are very unlikely to want to have a career in things like volunteering or working for a charity. And this is highly problematic if you think about it. Because those people who do go into those kinds of jobs, particularly teenagers who go on to volunteer, what we know about those people is that they really have high levels of cultural and social capital. They're particularly girls, and they prioritise, so the data tells us, known face-to-face relationships, and they communicate lots. Now, this should be of alarm because actually what my research shows is that as children get older, so they are less likely to connect with the people around them and do these kinds of things, particularly around things like what we might call commonality. That is, that children seem to show that they have less in common with each other and in continuity. So, the K-Dogs comment of earlier, actually children we found are less likely to want to connect with someone 5-10 years ahead. And actually that shouldn't surprise us. We shouldn't be shocked about that, because actually school isn't fashioned like that as a team endeavour. In fact, rather than that, it's highly individualised, individualistic, personalised. This is my world, my life, my grades. Why should I care about the person next to me? You'll go into employment, I will go into a job, but we should worry about that. What we found in particular was that girls form far more stable and connected relationships with boys, however. And that shouldn't surprise us either, because actually the roots of that, what we found, what the academic literature tells you, is that girls are far more likely to have relationships that are dyadic, and the relationships within them are much stronger. They're based on far much more communication. They're far better at self-disclosing, sharing more personal information, whereas boys, of course, are just a little bit more rough and tumble. Their relationships are characterized by dominance and hierarchy and competition. The most worrying statistic there, these percentages behind me represent the levels of relational health we found within these groups on average. The most worrying statistic we found was actually that boys and girls seem, in particular as they get older, to relate very poorly to each other. In fact, actually, one of the common responses when I was delivering the surveys was, well, why would I even want to think about that? It's not as if I want to go out with her. And actually, even the academic literature doesn't really distinguish. There's very little that distinguishes between connected relationships and actually romantic attachments. And of course, any kind of response like that really fails to recognise why we need a friendship, why we need some kind of platonic association. It also fails to recognise actually how we measure a relationship, which isn't actually about how much you like somebody, whether you even like them. It's the degree to which we know somebody, and we need to know each other better, particularly as we get older. And it's my assumption, actually, that school is a place which, because of the way that it's structured, tends to stifle those kinds of innate abilities to cooperate and to connect at a time when we really need it to do quite the other thing, because we know more now from the fields of social neuroscience than we've ever done about the ability of our relationships to have profound impacts on our brains and our bodies, and the ability of it actually for us to lead a healthy, happy, and long life. Let me give an example of that. In terms of learning well, I mean, this shouldn't surprise us at all. I mean, learning is mutual and it is deeply social. You know, learning in classrooms isn't a sort of an independent cognitive thing. It is a social thing. And therefore we know that children really struggle to learn if they're frightened, if they don't feel they belong in a classroom, if they feel in some way they're unhappy. Happiness is a really important thing to learning. Next slide, please. Thank you very much. I'll tell you a story from my own world. My daughter's teacher came out to see us the other day and said that she'd been really impressed with her because there was somebody else in the class who was really struggling with relationships in the class, and it got so bad they actually didn't feel like they wanted to come into school. And my daughter, a 6-year-old, had taken this young individual under her wing and had befriended him that day. And this had turned this boy's day around, so we're told. He went home beaming, smiling, all because of the kindness of a small 6-year-old. Now, I don't tell you that out of pride. You understand, Dr. Relational Schools, his daughter gets relationships. Oh, isn't that brilliant? I tell you because the very next day, she had been excluded from her friendship group, and it had destroyed her world. And now, you might say to me, well, you know, this is just the fickle nature of children. They just experience that ebb and flow of relationships day in, day out. And that is true. But the problem is, if that becomes an ebb, if that becomes a fixed pattern, then the danger is actually it can become something that is systemic right into adulthood. I'm going to show you some difficult photos now, and I'm sorry if I struggle with this. These photographs are taken the day I was released from hospital, when I was about 13, 14. And as you can see, I struggled with relationships quite badly at school. And actually what it culminated in was a rather nasty fight. And it wasn't that sort of fight with two preppy sort of boys in blazers pulling each other's ties, calling each other swines, you understand. This was one of those fights where you're kind of held and someone pounds on your face for minutes. And I tell you this story because I have to say, I bear no ill will to the guy who did it. You know, it was something that happened to me at school. But of course, at the time, I really focused on the physical scars. You know, they say sticks and stones may break your bones, but names will never hurt you. Well, I tell you, it's not true. That which is done to us is nowhere near as significant of that which happens in us. Because that day onwards, I was really frightened of going to school, really struggled with going to school, really struggled with the process of learning. I started to do quite badly in my studies. But what the school did was to intervene, to graft me onto a new group of relationships, find me new friends, to stand by me. And do you know what? The first person they asked me to go and sit next to in science was the very person who met me at university on the first day that I went to university. And I ended up doing really well and going to university, and I got my doctorate about a month ago. And that trajectory from that moment there all the way to this point about being here now, that comes from the relationships that were formed around me. So they had an impact on both my health and my happiness. But you know what? Next slide, please. They also have a profound impact on our health. So for example, now we know that the quality of our connected relationships can actually impact our ability to fight off infection. We know that actually, scientific research tells us that actually the quality of our friendships and connected relationships can actually impact the rate at which tumours grow, not whether you get them or not, but how fast they progress. We know that dementia rates, for example, in men are much lower if they come from very close relationships. The danger is here we start thinking about social capital, social networks. But that shouldn't be the thing that determines what closeness looks like, because you cannot determine that by counting the number of people you know. I like to refer more to relational capital. That is the collective value of all the networks we have, because it's true to say that it is the close friendships that will really help us when we are struggling. When you are in a crisis, it's the people who love you and come round you that matter, not the people known to you on LinkedIn. I'm struggling for time here, but I'm going to tell this story anyway. I often receive a message through Facebook. I'd actually received a notification just while I was sat there, and it says to me, "Did you know you have more friends than you think you have?" And do you ever get an email like that? And I think to myself, no, I don't. I think I know exactly how many friends I have because I invest all my time in those kinds of relationships. But the problem is, the next slide is, what's the impact of that? I mean, what's the impact of thinking we're connected to everybody, but actually being quite disconnected from the people around us? Well, I tell you what the impact is these kinds of statistics here. We've started to silo demographically more rapidly since 2001, and as a result, we are less likely, because of the way we live our lives, to talk to our neighbours. We tend to live in areas where we all of a very similar age. And this has profound consequences at a time when war and economic depression continue to displace the really settled communities of the world. If we cannot live in those settled communities, we have to know how to build them. And that's why our research has looked at relational schools, the concept of building connected communities in schools. Because schools are communities. They're wonderful, positive, personal places where children should be, and often are in many schools in this country, treated as an end in themselves. They are not, and this is what the examination system, the competition, the individualism does, often means that some schools, are a bit more like societies. What I mean by that is they're social forms, they're negative, they're impersonal, where lots of children don't know each other, where lots of staff even don't even know their names properly or stuff that they do. But schools aren't just communities. You understand, if you build strong relationships in school, what happens is you start to model and shape the relationships that exist and mirrored in the outside world. Schools aren't just communities. They're the first place we learn to live in community. TED is an institution that shares great stories of things that make a difference. My research, I hope, is starting to try and do that, to tell the great stories of the brilliant schools in the UK who do lots of innovation work with their school day, with their curriculum, with fabulous teachers who connect with those children, who enable children to connect with each other. Because if you can do that, then actually you don't just promote academic mastery, you actually promote things like reconciliation, social cohesion, even peace. And if we want a different kind of future, then we need you, teachers out there, because you are the great hope. You are the agents who will either maintain the kinds of fragmentation that I'm seeing in some of my research or build peaceful futures in this world. Thank you very much.